Okay, so we're going to start talking about the time period of 1820 to 1848. This is going to start with the kind of beginning of the factory system. So this is going to be focused around kind of stuff happening in the north for the most part. And in the factory system these factories were in the north, particularly New England. And this is the first widespread use of factories, right? So this is in the north. And they're creating textiles. Textiles are created from cotton, right, which was grown in the south. So the south does need start to use the cotton that is produced in the south here as well. So we're going to start with we're going to look at race, class, and gender in this time period. Those are all related to the theme of identity, and so these are always things to consider, like when an event is happening or when a time period you're looking at a time period. What is happening with racial identity, class identity, and gender identity? So we're going to start with race. So since we're focusing on the North here, we're going to be talking about free African Americans in the North, particularly in northern cities. Now, they were free, so they were not slaves, but they were still at the bottom of social classes, right? Many of these free African Americans had either escaped slavery or they were the children of people who had escaped slavery. But for many of them, they were former slaves that were living in the North as free people. And so they, as a slave, when they were a slave in the South, they might have had skills, particular skills, maybe like a blacksmith or a cooper to make barrels or a carpenter or something, right? But due to competition and discrimination, they mostly could only find work as servants and unskilled labor. So they were kind of not utilizing some of the skills that they had available to them. So they were kind of working below their level of expertise. They also were not allowed to vote, and they also were not allowed to attend kind of public schools. So overall, for African Americans in the North, they still faced discrimination. They were at the bottom of the social class. So they were not. They did have some degree of freedom, which was certainly better than in the South, where they had none. But it was not as if they were able to live equally with among kind of the white people of the North. Next, we have class. So class, this is kind of there's a lot of things happening in regarding class in this time period. First of all, we have to talk about immigration and who is coming and the social class of those people that are coming. So in this time period, you have two main types of immigration. We have German immigration and Irish immigration. That accounted for the majority of immigration during this time period. Now, the immigrants were different. German immigrants, they were political refugees. They were coming due to a revolution in Germany. They were coming with mostly families, some single men, but mostly families. And because they had some money, they were able to often settle in Western towns. They could be farmers. They could move a little bit more inland. So they were a little bit more well established because they had some money. On the other hand, the Irish immigrants, they were not political kind of refugees. They were economic ones because you had the potato famine in Ireland, which was led to starvation. And, the potato famine was a disease that affected potatoes in Ireland and potatoes were a crop that the Irish depended upon. So when the crop failed in Ireland, it resulted in a lot of Irish leaving Ireland to come to the United States. Many of these were young single women. And so when they would come, they didn't have any money. They didn't really have a lot of opportunities either. So they ended up settling in northern cities, places like Boston or New York City. Even today, Boston has a reputation of being a center of kind of Irish culture in America. And so they were very poor. So these are very different than the Germans. So these were settling in urban areas. The Germans often settled in more rural areas. The Germans had some money. The Irish were pretty poor. The Germans were coming for political reasons. The Irish for economic ones. So once the immigration begins in the 1840s, the jobs that were available to particularly the Irish began to replace the women that were working in the factories. So the factories that started here in this factory system were initially, the workers were initially young single women. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the Irish actually began to replace them because they could work cheaper and they weren't as, they didn't have to be treated as good, I guess, as the Irish. So the result here is decline in wages. So skilled workers made between $4 to $10 a week. unskilled between $1 to $6 per week. So imagine what that would be like if that was your paycheck. So wages actually declined a little bit, in part due to the competition for jobs. And so unions began to develop. Now, a union is a group of workers that get together to try and negotiate wages and working conditions. And one of their main tools is to go on strike, where they would stop working in protest until they got better conditions. That was their main weapon. So unions kind of first came up around this time. So the first trade unions, they were done by skilled workers, and they were starting in like the 1830s. But you have an economic panic of 1837 that really weakened them, because in an economic panic, there are less jobs available. So trade unions had a lot less leverage over their employers, because people were eager to work. So if a union went on strike, the company could just fire everybody and hire. There were plenty of other people to take those jobs. There's also a court case that you might want to remember. This is not a Supreme Court case, but this is the Massachusetts court case, in which it actually recognized unions as kind of a legal group that could be formed. So this gave a little bit of protection to unions, not very much, but it's kind of the start of this. This will kind of be ignored for a long time, but this is the first time that unions are recognized by the courts as being kind of lawful groups. So overall, in terms of society, in terms of social classes, you kind of have like, we're talking about among the white people of the North, because remember, the free African Americans were at the bottom of the social classes. So you have these merchants and industrialists that were getting pretty wealthy. They lived in these lavish homes in places like New York City. So they lived in the cities. Your second group would be kind of an expanding middle class, which is kind of growing, kind of the supervisors of the factory floor, maybe. They had they owned their own homes, and they were able to hire servants. So you have this middle class that's kind of growing. Then you have the workers and artisans. These are kind of skilled workers and artisans. They rented houses, but their lives were getting better as well. Then you have the bottom, you have the urban poor. These are like the Irish immigrants, and they lived in these kind of very poor neighborhoods, like we call them slums today. So this kind of our social class is here. And what's starting to happen is we're starting to see a large gap between the rich and the poor. So that gap is growing. All right, in terms of gender, you have, this is mostly about women. So the Lowell factory system comes up around this time, and these are young single women that are working in factories, in these textile factories. They will eventually be replaced by the Irish in the 1840s, but starting in the 1820s, you have the Lowell system. And these women that were working in the factories, they lived in these kind of dormitories. And there were strict rules about no drinking, no overnight guests. They had to be in by a certain time or curfew. So there was this kind of element of kind of protecting these women. Now, they're young single women, not married, because the idea was you would, as a young woman, you might leave home to go live at the dorm in the factory, work there for a couple of years, save your money, send your money home, and then get married, and then you would never work again. So that was kind of the pattern that was happening. Now, the work inside the factory was very repetitive, but the wages were actually pretty decent for that time. They were paid pretty well. Okay, but you did have these some of these women that did form kind of a union, the Factory Girls Association, which was for these Lowell workers. They actually went on strike in 1836. But again, the Panic of 1837 kind of ended that organization due to competition. And then later on, we'll see the Irish replace these women as workers. So in terms of the role of women in society, for middle-class women, there was generally no working outside the home. Poor women, yes, they definitely did, oftentimes as servants and that sort of thing. You have this idea of, it's called the cult of domesticity here. So domesticity, like domestic work, so inside the house. So this is the domestic kind of nature of mothers, right? So their job is to be a mom and raise the kids. Women are also part of consumer culture. And so they start to make purchases, and there's a distinct female culture, kind of what they called a separate sphere for women that was kind of isolating for them. But there were women's magazines that came out that were geared towards these middle class women, in which there was kind of like, articles about things that mothers would know or should know, that sort of thing. So it was all geared towards women and their separate sphere. Now, this time there are some contradictory characteristics. The most kind of notable is this feeling of nativism, anti-immigrant feeling, because immigrants were taking jobs and were seen as less civilized. You also have the Know Nothing Party, which developed, which was the strongest in New England, and they are kind of a nativist party. And there was very limited social mobility for people. You couldn't really rise up from being poor to rich. You might become more skilled, but over time, but you wouldn't have a lot of room to move up. All right, finally, let's wrap up here. We have the 1848, the Declaration of Sentiments. This is going to kind of end the time period. This is a document that was written to demand that women be treated fairly, and it was modeled after the Declaration of Independence and kind of begins the movement for women in search of equality. All right, that's it.